guys, Mr. Klein here, and I am in downtown Lafayette, and behind me here is the statue of Confederate General Alfred Mouton. So with it being 2020 and all, the presence of this statue is just a little bit controversial. But what we're talking about today is not statues. Actually, it is about the Civil War though, specifically the Bayou Teche campaign in the spring of 1863, where over 20,000 Union and Confederate soldiers marched, fought, and died through several towns and cities throughout here in Acadiana. So in this episode and in this series, we're going to take a drive through the invasion route. We're going to see the sights, and we're going to hear accounts from the people who were there and experienced this relatively forgotten event in Civil War history. So before we look at the Civil War coming to Acadiana, we need to understand what was going on in Louisiana at the beginning of 1863. So you see, Louisiana was extremely wealthy at the outbreak of the war, thanks to the cotton and sugar industries like this sugar refinery right here, as well as the fact that New Orleans was the largest and most powerful city in the Confederacy. In fact, New Orleans was actually larger than the next 5 largest cities in the South combined. Not only that, it was one of the United States' main commercial hubs. So this made Louisiana a really prime target for Union forces. On April 25th, 1862, a Union fleet brushed past the forts of Jackson and St. Philip and captured the city without firing a shot on May 1st. In the panic of the loss of New Orleans, the Confederate government of Louisiana abandoned Baton Rouge and they set up shop to the west in Opelousas. So they conceded the city to the Union. Now, an attempt by the Confederacy to retake Baton Rouge on August 5th, 1862 failed, leaving only the heavy defenses at Port Hudson, which was north of Baton Rouge, and Vicksburg, Mississippi, standing in the way between the Union splitting the Confederacy in half and controlling the entire Mississippi River, which is what President Lincoln called the backbone of the rebellion. Despite this, as 1863 began, President Lincoln actually needed a really big victory here in the Western Confederacy. Commercial interests in the Northeast and Midwest were agitating for a break in the deadlock. So in the Northeast, textile mills needed cotton because they had traditionally purchased it in the South and now they couldn't. In the Midwest, farmers and merchants really needed the Mississippi River to trade goods with the eastern United States because there really weren't enough railroads that ran actually from east to west. If companies started to go broke, political support for Lincoln and the war could actually vanish, as seen in the congressional elections in the fall of 1862. So despite only controlling the Mississippi River and surrounding areas between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, the Union actually held the source of most of the wealth of the state of Louisiana before the Civil War began. Despite this, the amount of cotton sent back to the Union in 1862 from Union-controlled areas was only 1% of what was shipped before the war. To placate both sets of business interests, the War Department authorized an expedition in Louisiana in order to assist Ulysses S. Grant's campaign against the Confederate city of Vicksburg, as well as capture more cotton acreage and set the stage for a further invasion of Texas in the future. Soldiers from New England and New York were recruited and they were sent to New Orleans under the command of Massachusetts politician Nathaniel P Banks. Nathaniel P Banks was an influential Republican politician, and in the 1850s he had served as Speaker of the House and Congress as well as the governor of Massachusetts up until the end of 1860. So he was one of Lincoln's political generals whose appointment angered many regular Army officers who were seeking these positions, who had been educated at West Point. He led soldiers in Northern Virginia in 1862 and he was unimpressive. Afterward, Banks was sent to New Orleans to replace the reviled or revered, so depending on your viewpoint during the Civil War, Benjamin Butler. So he had 2 purposes of his command in New Orleans. It was 1, to revive agricultural shipments to the north, and 2, it was to complete the opening of the Mississippi River to the Union. Opposing Banks was the Confederate General Richard Taylor, the son of the 12th President of the United States and Mexican-American war hero Zachary Taylor. So his college education began at Harvard, but was completed actually at Yale. So while he did own a plantation in St. Charles Parish and was a state senator at the outbreak of the Civil War in Louisiana, he actually opposed secession. He was known for his knowledge of military history as not only a general's son, but throughout college his nose was always stuck in military history books. So he was like a military history nerd. So he began the Civil War as a civilian assistant with the Confederate Army. Eventually he became a brigadier general commanding a brigade of Louisiana infantry, and he showed considerable talent in leading them. And by July of 1862, he was actually promoted to major general and put in command of all Confederate forces south of the Red River in Louisiana. And so his orders were this: he was to limit Union advances as much as possible for moving northward in the state. So at the beginning of the Bayou Teche campaign, he only had about 4,000 men under his command. Most of them were actually poorly supplied local draftees picked up from the area, bolstered by Texas regulars. So throughout late 1862, Union forces gained control over most of southeast Louisiana, pushing along the railroad line to the settlement of Brashear City, which is now Morgan City, near the mouth of the Atchafalaya River. The Confederate forces in the area were far too weak to offer much resistance, and they abandoned the town and the small fort of Berwick on the other side of the river. Union gunboats and soldiers had already cleared the west bank of the Atchafalaya and Bayou Teche up around Patterson. But in the last attempt, the gunboat Diana was captured by the Confederates and added to their defenses along the Teche. Brashear City was already home to several thousand Union soldiers from previous activity in the area, but the arrival of over 15,000 men overwhelmed the settlement that was really only a city only in name. In fact, it had only been created 3 years previously. In fact, the Union forces Banks brought with him to Brashear City is larger than the population of the city even today. Banks took most of his 19 corps, 3 infantry divisions containing artillery and about 5,500 men each, 3 cavalry regiments with about 600 men each, along with supporting river gunboats and barges. Union forces started crossing the river on April the 9th, with 2 of his divisions marching along Bayou Teche under the command of Brigadier General William Emory. 2 days later, on the 12th, his 3rd Division, under the command of Brigadier General Cuvier Grover, boarded boats and sailed up the Atchafalaya and into the basin, with the purpose of landing north of Franklin in order to cut off Taylor and eliminate rebel opposition in Acadiana. So in order to do this, Banks needed his main force to engage the rebels and distract them while Grover sailed by them. The 114th New York Volunteers described the march from Berwick as, "Cheerily the men marched out of the encampment at Berwick and sang and chattered as they trampled along the dusty road by the banks of the bay. They did not know where they were going, nor did they care to know. The music of the bands for a time quickened their steps, increasing the jest and merriment of singing." The first battle of the campaign was here, just north of Patterson at Fort Bisland. The area was an open area of land about 2,000 yards between dense swampland and divided in half by Bayou Teche, meaning that this was the only place where Union forces could travel by land toward Franklin. There's actually no sign that the battle took place today. US 90 actually travels right through the area, and part of the battlefield was actually removed as a part of creation of Wax Lake Outlet in 1941 and 1942 for flood relief of the lower Atchafalaya River. In fact, only until recently there was a sign there, but in recent times it's actually been removed, whether through an accident or something else. General Taylor ordered defenses be built here, and the Confederates under the command of Brigadier General Henry Sibley settled in to wait for the eventual Union assault. Now, calling Bisland a fort is a bit of a stretch, as it was merely dirt fortifications on both sides of the bayou, protecting about 18 artillery pieces. So with the Diana, however, it had more bite, and it gave a chance for the 2,200 rebels there to hold the Union advance, at least temporarily. On the 11th and morning of the 12th, gunfire was repeatedly exchanged between skirmishers, or small units of men who served as feelers for the larger units and allowed the armies to determine the movement of their opponents. Confederate skirmishers fell back and reported the slow Union advance covered by their own gunboats coming up the Teche. By 4:30 p.m. on the 12th, Union forces stopped their advance less than a mile from the fort and deployed their artillery under fire. So for the remainder of the afternoon, both Union and Confederate artillery traded fire. But however, due to the distance, there were light casualties on both sides. So like today, the battlefield was through sugarcane fields, which attacking through was described as, "The fields through which we marched were covered with a growth of sugarcane, so high that the lines were almost concealed, and so dense that it required the most fatiguing labor for the men to push their way through, jumping from cane row to cane row, leaping over ditches, crowding between stiff cane stalks, wading through a mud hole beneath a scalding sun. The boys toiled on, stopping every few minutes to reform the line, which necessarily became broken, for it was impossible for one man to see more than a half dozen of his comrades at a time." At sundown, the gunfire ceased, and both sides decided to settle down for the night. The Union forces laid out their sleeping pads and just slept in the cane fields like this. Overnight, General Taylor arrived from Franklin with the knowledge that Grover was intending to land behind them to encircle his forces. So he ordered General Sibley to launch a surprise attack at dawn, with the purpose of hopefully putting the Union forces in disarray and force Banks to call Grover's forces back. back from their attempt of landing. However, Sibley did not follow that order, and the battle resumed at 9 a.m. when Banks ordered his forces forward again. In order to relieve the pressure on the fort, the Diana sailed downstream to shoot both flanks of the Union forces. Union artillery focused on the heavily armored vessel, and a lucky shot pierced her iron plate armor. This shot damaged the steam boiler, killing 2 men and wounding 5 others. So what ended up happening was the Diana fell back this way for repairs, and any chance of stopping the Union advance vanished. The artillery duel resumed as both sides tried to knock each other's guns out, while the infantry either took cover in ditches for the Union side or behind the embankments for the rebels. So the majority of Confederate soldiers on the west bank of the Teche right here had actually never seen battle, and General Taylor knew he needed to boost their morale in case they had to face a direct Union assault. He did this by doing the following. Mounting the breastwork, I made a cigarette, struck fire with my briquette, and walked up and down smoking. Near the line was a low tree with spreading branches, which a young officer, Bradford by name, proposed to climb, so as to have a better view. I gave him my field glass, and this plucky youngster sat in his tree quietly as in a chimney corner, though the branches around were cut away by gunfire. The Union infantry attempted to assault the positions by going through woods on the edges of the fort like this. However, the Confederates were able to throw back every attack, and equivalent Confederate counterattacks through the woods were turned away as well. According to the official history of the Union forces present, during the late afternoon, General Banks became really nervous that his elaborate plan was about to fail, and the Confederates would escape in the night. He ordered his forces on both sides of the bayou to prepare to launch a full assault if the opportunity presented itself. His subordinates began preparations and waited for the order that never came. Late in the afternoon, news came that Grover's forces had indeed landed north of Franklin. Banks recalled his men in order to rest and prepare because his trap in order to capture General Taylor was about to be sprung. This lack of initiative was all Taylor needed, as he ordered the Confederates to withdraw as quickly as possible to Franklin and then onward to New Iberia before the Union forces could totally encircle them. So what he did was he placed Brigadier General Alfred Bouton, yeah, that guy, commander of the forces on the east bank of the Teche over there, in charge of the withdrawal. He ordered him to provide a rear guard in case the Union forces decided to pursue them up the road. While there was an attempt to sneak away without the Union noticing them, moving 2,000 plus men, horses, guns, and everything else an army needs to fight isn't a silent affair. In an article written afterward, Union reporters discussed the retreat as, quote, "At 11:30 on the night of the 14th, Colonel Kimball of the 53rd Massachusetts heard the enemy making preparations for evacuating his entrenchments. The moving of artillery and baggage wagons, packing and nailing of boxes, and drivers cursing their mules could be distinctly heard by the advanced pickets of Colonel Gooding's brigade." General Banks only received this news at 3 a.m. as the last of the rebels withdrew. So what he did was he hurriedly ordered his men into formation, and at first light, they launched the full assault on Fort Bisland, only discovered that it was empty. So instead of trying to chase down the Confederates, who were only 4 to 5 miles ahead of him up the road, Banks allowed the men to celebrate their victory and then settle down and actually cook breakfast and eat it before getting back on the march. The two-day battle ended with 234 Union casualties, that's wounded and killed, while the rebels suffered an unknown number of casualties. Some estimates say about 450 Confederates were wounded or killed in total in this battle. While the Battle of Fort Bisland resulted in a Union victory, by virtue of the rebels' withdrawal, Banks had seriously blundered in not pursuing Mouton and his men. He was confident that General Grover's landing upriver near Sharonton would cut off their retreat. Thus, he didn't feel the need for a speedy pursuit. This complacency cost him the opportunity to complete the Bayou Teche campaign in a single afternoon, as events up the bayou would soon prove. This has been an episode of Battlefield Louisiana, a series of videos that explores the military history of Louisiana. In our next video, actually, we're heading up the road to the Battle of Irish Bend, which is outside of Franklin, where we get to see whether General Nathaniel Banks' plan to encircle and destroy General Taylor's army actually worked out. If you like this video, click on the like button. If you want to see more science and history videos like this, also go ahead and click on the subscribe button right here, and make sure you click on the bell icon in order to get notifications. If you got any questions, put them in the comments below, and thanks for watching.